What if I told you that a single signature written in haste and under pressure redrew the borders of Europe, and no one fully realized it until it was too late? Not a declaration of war, not a grand treaty between empires, but a small procedural decision by a man who thought he was just doing his job. No parades, no explosions, no blood spilled at that moment. Just ink, paper, and a tired official who couldn't have imagined that what he was about to authorize would ignite a chain reaction of events still echoing through the continent today. Our story begins in 1919, in a Europe that had just emerged from the wreckage of the First World War. Millions were dead, empires had crumbled, and a new world was supposed to be taking shape at the Paris Peace Conference. Diplomats from across the globe had gathered at Versailles to redraw borders, decide reparations, and prevent another global catastrophe. But behind the closed doors and elegant speeches, the pressure was mounting. The victors were tired, angry, and deeply divided. The losers, well, they weren't even in the room. Among the many decisions being made, some seemed small, technical, even boring. Who gets what part of which forest? Which village goes to which country? Where does this or that railway station fall? Most of these questions were handed off to subcommittees and clerks. One of those clerks was a British civil servant named Harold Nicholson, a junior diplomat tasked with helping draw the new border between Poland and the new Republic of Czechoslovakia. Now here's where things get strange. Poland and Czechoslovakia had both just been born out of the ruins of empires. Both wanted a region called Teschen, an industrial area rich in coal, with a mixed population of Poles, Czechs, and Germans. There had already been fighting over it in 1918, and the situation was tense. But with bigger powers distracted, no one wanted to deal with it. So the job of drawing the line fell to a subcommittee. A few overworked diplomats, limited information, and a looming deadline. Harold Nicholson, looking at a map late one night, made a choice. He drew a line that gave the key railway junction to Czechoslovakia instead of Poland. Why? He later wrote that the map was unclear, the instructions vague, and he had to make a judgment call. He assumed it would be reviewed, maybe adjusted later. He signed off on it and went to bed. But the signature held. It became official and Poland was furious. What followed wasn't just a local squabble. That line would spark a series of escalations, border clashes, and eventually, a deep distrust between two countries that were supposed to be allies. When Hitler came to power years later, he would exploit that rift to isolate Poland diplomatically. When Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, Poland didn't protest. And when Germany came for Poland, Czechoslovakia was already gone. But to truly understand how one tired clerk's pencil stroke could fracture the fragile unity of two new nations, we need to step back and meet the key players. In 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, it left behind a vacuum filled with ambition, confusion, and overlapping claims. Both Poland and Czechoslovakia emerged from the chaos hoping to reclaim lands they believed were historically theirs. And one of the most hotly contested areas was the Teschen region, known as Kizyn in Polish and Teschen in Czech. Teschen wasn't just a dot on the map. It was a jewel of coal and steel, a vital industrial region that powered railways and heated homes. And it held strategic value too. Most critically, the Košice-Bohumín Railway, a lifeline connecting Slovakia to the broader European network. Whoever controlled that railway held a logistical and economic advantage, but the area's population was mixed, mostly Polish, but with significant Czech and German minorities. That made the perfect recipe for conflict. At first, things played out like a territorial dispute. Both countries sent in administrators, police, and even troops. Skirmishes broke out. In early 1919, as peace negotiations were beginning in Paris, Polish and Czechoslovak forces clashed in open battle over Teschen. It was short, intense, and embarrassing. Two allies who had fought the Central Powers now fighting each other. The Allied powers, already overwhelmed by dozens of similar disputes around the collapsing empires, forced a ceasefire and promised to settle the matter at the peace conference. But here's the twist. When the Teschen question landed on the diplomats' desks in Paris, it wasn't treated with urgency. It didn't have the global weight of the German reparations or the League of Nations. It was a footnote, a side quest. And yet, in the shadows of Versailles, where redrawing borders had become routine, a small commission was assembled to determine Teschen's fate. They had a few maps, some census data, a limited local knowledge, and a directive to wrap it up quickly. Harold Nicholson and his fellow clerks were not malevolent. They weren't out to ruin anyone's future. But they were overworked, underinformed, and perhaps most importantly, detached. For them, this wasn't personal, it was administrative. Draw a line, submit a report, move on. But for the people of Teschen, that line would decide who they paid taxes to, what language their children would learn in school, and which army would recruit their sons. For national leaders, it was about pride and identity. And for the region itself, it would mean years of tension, militarization, and distrust. When the final recommendation was issued, it gave the critical railway and most of the coal resources to Czechoslovakia, while leaving much of the ethnically Polish population under Czech control. Poland protested loudly, but the decision stuck. The resentment didn't fade. In fact, it festered. Both countries began preparing for the possibility of renewed conflict. They fortified borders, built propaganda campaigns, and quietly considered each other potential enemies. Fast forward to the late 1930s. Hitler, now Chancellor of Germany, was watching Europe with a predator's patience. He knew the key to expanding without immediate resistance was to divide his potential opponents. And Teschen, still a wound in Polish-Czech relations, was the perfect lever. When Hitler annexed the Sudetenland in 1938 under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans, Poland seized the moment. They issued an ultimatum to Czechoslovakia demanding the Teschen region. The Czechs, already collapsing under German pressure, gave in. Poland occupied Teschen with barely a shot fired, but in doing so, they lost the moral high ground. In the eyes of the West, Poland had behaved opportunistically, grabbing land from a neighbor just as Hitler was doing the same on a much larger scale. This would have consequences. The British and French, who might have otherwise seen Poland as a clear victim in 1939, now remembered 1938. And when the war finally began, Poland found itself isolated. And all of this? It started with a single signature, a sleepy decision made under fluorescent lights, a clerk doing his job, a line drawn across a map, a butterfly flapping its wings in the halls of Versailles. Oh, so how exactly did one scribbled signature in a quiet room in Paris turn into a geopolitical fracture line? To answer that, we need to understand how unstable the post-war order truly was. The map of Europe wasn't redrawn with a surgeon's precision. It was done in a rush, under pressure, and often by people who had never set foot in the regions they were dividing. They had to rely on secondhand reports, outdated statistics, and a mountain of conflicting claims. Teschen was just one of dozens of disputes the Allied commissions were juggling. And with limited time, they looked for simple solutions to complex problems. The clerk who signed off on the boundary, his name isn't even remembered in most records, was following instructions. But those instructions were vague. He drew a line that made sense on paper. Follow the river, give the railway to the state with greater need, preserve industrial capacity. But what he didn't account for was the human factor. The families that would be split, the farmers whose land would be bisected, the schools that would suddenly switch languages overnight. The line was submitted. Approved, filed, done. But for the people of Teschen, the decision felt arbitrary and unfair. Polish resentment grew not only because of the outcome, but because of how impersonal the process had been. It didn't feel like a resolution. It felt like betrayal. And that emotion echoed in their national politics for years. In Czechoslovakia, the government was just as uneasy. They had gained valuable territory, but at the cost of worsening relations with a key neighbor. So both countries fortified, literally. They built bunkers, watchtowers, trenches, not against Germany or the Soviet Union, but against each other. They trained troops for a future conflict over a few hundred square kilometers of disputed land. The situation simmered throughout the 1920s and early 30s. Tensions cooled on the surface but never disappeared. And then came Munich. When Hitler forced Czechoslovakia to hand over the Sudetenland in 1938, Poland made its move. They sent an ultimatum, hand over Teschen, or else. The Czechs, already crumbling under Nazi pressure, capitulated. And in October 1938, Polish troops marched into the region, cheered by some, feared by others. To Warsaw, it looked like a patriotic victory. A historic injustice corrected, but to the outside world it looked different. France and Britain watched Poland act not as a victim of aggression, but as an opportunist. This would come back to haunt them less than a year later. Because when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, Warsaw expected the West to respond immediately and forcefully, and they did declare war on Germany. But they didn't move quickly. There was hesitation, skepticism. Some in London and Paris quietly wondered, would Poland have helped them if the roles were reversed? In a twist of irony, the very region Poland fought to reclaim, Opportunistic, was among the first to fall to Nazi forces. The strategic railway it held was now in Hitler's hands. And after the war, when the borders were redrawn yet again, Opportunistic would be divided once more, this time by Soviet-backed decree. What began as a signature in Versailles ended in tanks rolling through streets that had changed flags too many times to count. But the real domino effect wasn't just territorial, it was psychological. It showed how fragile post-war peace could be, how a careless decision made without local insight or empathy could fuel decades of suspicion, and how even small wounds in diplomacy, if left untreated, can become deep scars. And that brings us to the heart of the mystery. Not the borders, not the battles, but the signature. One name scrawled in ink at the end of a long and chaotic process. A gesture so ordinary it barely made a sound at the time, yet its echo reshaped lives, triggered conflict, and rewired diplomatic trust for decades. It's tempting to see history as the sum of grand speeches and famous names. But sometimes, the most profound consequences stem from the unnoticed, the bureaucratic, the routine. The Teschen crisis didn't start with hatred. It started with ambiguity, with assumptions, with haste. And it shows us how systems, when strained, often rely on shortcuts. That one person with a pen in hand and pressure on their shoulders can set in motion a series of events they'll never witness the end of. It's easy to ask, could it have been avoided? If the commission had taken a few more days, if they had walked the streets of the towns they were dividing, if they had spoken to the people whose lives they were reshaping. But history doesn't operate on what-ifs, it operates on what was signed. And perhaps that's the unsettling lesson here. That behind every seemingly inevitable headline, border conflict, invasion, betrayal, there's a quiet moment of decision, a tipping point, a signature, not written with evil intent, not even with full understanding. Just a signature, but one that, in this case, redrew a region, reframed alliances, and helped lay the unstable foundations for a continent on the edge of another war. So next time you look at a map and trace the contours of a border, ask yourself, was that line drawn with wisdom or with urgency? Because history often remembers the wars that follow, but not always the moments that make them possible. If you found this story as surprising as we did, and you want to keep uncovering the invisible hinges of history, the small moments with colossal consequences, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Domino Effect. Because the past isn't just a list of dates, it's a detective story, and the clues are everywhere.